hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com for past episodes, blogs, and forums. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. Well, a little bit handicapped here. I hope things go well because we lost internet in my office and I had to run to a hotel. That's how dedicated I am. But I might not be able to go in the chat room because the internet here is not so good. We're hoping it hangs in there. Tonight we have a great guest lined up, Jesse Marcel III. But before that, we have an astronomy clip with Andy Fleming on our magnetosphere, which you probably know that has to do with saving us from being fried by the sun, like Mars probably went through. It may have even had life at one point, but lost all its atmosphere, and that we hope never happens to us. Our newscaster, John Tobin, and I actually recorded a session last night for the UFO news, and our audio systems had some type of allergic reaction to each other. It was either that or he was making a blender full of frozen margaritas and just not telling me about it. But anyway, here is the clip from Andy Fleming in the UK on the Earth's magnetosphere.
Hello, Martin and listeners. Today we're taking a look at the magnetosphere, which is a protective field that extends for thousands of miles into space. Its magnetism affects everything from global communication to weather patterns. Created by the Earth's spinning molten core, its existence means that charged particles of the solar wind are unable to cross the magnetic field lines and are deflected around the Earth towards the poles. Now this causes beautiful auroras, sometimes appearing far south of their indigenous polar regions, like the recent displays in the mid-latitude zones. This life-protecting magnetic field has decreased by 15% over the last 2 centuries. Now, some scientists think this could be an indication that the Earth's poles are about to exhibit a long overdue flip. The Earth would be exposed to ozone layer damaging solar wind, while power supplies will be wiped out, the climate is changed, and cancer rates, I'm afraid, would rocket. A recent Danish study concludes that the magnetosphere has far more influence on climate change than carbon dioxide levels, and says the Earth is experiencing a natural period of low cloud cover due to fewer cosmic rays entering the atmosphere. In November last year, 3 spacecraft were launched as part of the Swarm mission to uncover the threat of magnetic field change and map it more accurately. Historic evidence shows how dramatically the field has decreased, and it appears that every few 100,000 years the polarity kind of flips, so compass would point south instead of north. A continued decline of the field over billions of years would see the Earth looking like Mars, a once oceanic world that has become dry and barren. However, the rate of decline is too fast for the Earth's core to simply burn out, and it could be that the Earth's poles are about to undergo another flip. If this occurs, it would cause the Earth's magnetic shield to be weakened for possibly thousands of years, opening up our defences and causing cosmic radiation to get through. Scientists point out that a magnetic flip would not be catastrophic, and not all of the effects will be bad. The much sought-after spectacle of an aurora would be visible every night all over the Earth as solar winds hit the atmosphere. There remains, however, much more work to be done in understanding the properties of the Earth's core and how it generates the magnetosphere. I'll be back with more astronomy news next week on Podcast UFO.
Well, thanks, Andy. That was great. Really enjoyed it. And, if you're listening live on the Dark Matter Radio Network, please jump over to podcastufo.com right on the sidebar. It's a 1-2 click. You're into our chat room. And you can ask our guests this evening some questions. I can read them. I may not be able to participate much in the chat room, but I can certainly read off questions to Jesse Marcel III. And Jesse Marcel III grew up listening to his grandfather and father, both talking about what they actually held in their hands related to the Roswell crash. And I'm pretty sure it had nothing to do with a weather balloon or any type of spy mogul, as the Air Force concluded in the 1990s. Roswell just will not go away, and the truth will always need to be separated from the myths, of course. There are many, many myths, but it will be talked about until we know the truth behind what we're actually seeing in our skies. Don't forget to sign up at the chat room and hang in there for our guest tonight, Jesse Marcel III. Jesse, how are you doing?
Great. How are you doing?
Good. Can you come up a little bit closer to your phone?
Is that better right there?
I think so. We'll bounce that off Keith. Keith, how's that sounding? He says it'll work. That's great.
Okay, good.
Success. We've had all kinds of little things happen tonight, but we're getting through this, and we're going to have a good show. And I'm so glad to have you on, Jesse. And I want to tell you, I had reached out to your father, or just started to reach out to your father just before his passing, and my condolences to you and your family. And I got to tell you, I was at a conference in Maine just after he passed away last year, and there was so many people talking about him, and Peter Robbins talked about him and had pictures of him, and it was really the room was, you could hear a pin drop. Your father was very, very well respected, and I've never heard an unkind word spoken of him.
Yeah, he definitely he really legitimized, the story of Roswell and the rest of it, just because he was so closely attached to it. And the same thing, his story never wavered. And he was also, he was a medical doctor, a colonel in the military, and he every time he talked about it, he was also putting his reputation in both those areas on the line.
Yes, yeah, and I will talk to you about that a little later on. And okay. I want to say hello, everyone, on the chat room. I'm not going to be able to participate a little too much tonight. I'll try here and there. We had some internet issues, but going all the way back to your grandfather. Now, I'd like to hear what I always try to figure out what questions to ask that are different than other people may have asked. And my question to you about your grandfather, did you ever hear him talk about Roswell before it came back into the limelight, like in the 1980 or so? Did you hear him talk about it before that time?
Well, yes, our family, we spent our summers in Louisiana with him. We were all from Montana, and we'd make the long 2,400-mile adventure during the summers. And that started basically, in the mid to late 70s, around 75 is when it started. And it was always a topic of conversation. Wow. So even before Stanton Friedman, that kind of thing, we grew up bathed in the story, of course, through my father originally as very young children. And we're taught to respect the idea that there was life in the universe off of the Earth, and that there was, civilizations that were very technologically advanced to the point where they could come and visit us, basically.
So another thing I'm wondering is how your family, including your father and grandfather, reacted when all of a sudden Roswell was the topic of the century, so to speak.
It's funny, and that's a very good question. On the family side, there really wasn't much difference.
Mm-hmm.
And we had talked about it, and I guess embraced it would be one word for it, but it didn't really change too much. My grandfather, I saw more of him when we weren't down there because of all his interviews and that kind of thing. But that was more on, the latest documentaries floating around, that kind of thing. But really, not much. I mean, the summers were down in Louisiana, and then the weekends, my father and grandfather always had a Saturday morning phone call. But that wasn't all about Roswell. It was about how LSU was doing in the latest football game, actually, and that kind of thing.
So it was just incorporated into a part of your life. And now, did you talk about this situation with, say, your friends and other people in school or something like that?
A little bit, and it more, that end of it came more through my father, in that when we were little kids, he walked out in the backyard with a pickaxe one morning, and within about a month, he had dug a hole and built an observatory.
Huh.
And all by hand. He with concrete, to putting the blocks up, to buying aluminum sheeting, making a dome. He even, one thing is he built a computer to drive the thing, and that was long before such a thing really existed. He bought these little glass tubes, wrapped wires around them. Each one was an X or an O or an on or off button, and he created a star mapping system. He was, if anything, he was an incredible physicist, a brilliant man, a good doctor, the rest of it, but his heart was really in physics. But anyway, back to the story. So we had an observatory, and that was directly related to Roswell. It was his search for life, and he always embraced the school system. We'd have Friday, Saturday nights. Sometimes we'd have classes and hordes of kids over at the house. Everybody looking at the observatory, and Roswell was spoken of. Never to the alarm of anybody. Always very positive on that matter, anyway.
Another thing that I heard about your father in particular several times, and again at that conference last year, was that your father was a true patriot, and he really, it really meant a lot to him to serve his country. Yes.
Yeah, he in his, I hate to put it, waning days, because they weren't waning at the time that we knew of anyway. Some of his responses would be that, please remember me for what I did for my country. And that
instead of Roswell.
Yes, yeah, that was it. He really, on his side, he was hoping to live long enough to hear our government publicly talk about Roswell and release the information and to finally, bring it to light. But no, he was very proud of his military career, and it's because Roswell, his father, and that kind of thing, that it was almost kind of intertwined.
Right, but I would think that he would have a sense of betrayal with the government, as they constantly brushed off Roswell and came up with the crash test dummies. That was impossible because they weren't even
sure, all that crazy nonsense. Yes.
So did he ever feel, to your knowledge, betrayed by his country in that way?
No, but he understood there was a big distinction between his life as a military officer and some things that the government was doing. He had some meetings, one I think is fairly publicly known, with Dick D'Amato, and where he was, he basically went out and had a conversation with Dick D'Amato. Actually, he had him go out there, and they talked about how not the question of Roswell being real or not, but basically that funds were being diverted to do this cover-up of Roswell at the time. This was the late 90s. But and they talked about, that those funds were being diverted to what people, there's some quasi-term, the black government, the hidden government, the whatever you want to call it. And they were investigating that, and Roswell was the basis of their investigation of how funds were being derived or being scooped in that direction. And he always did have the distinction between the government that you and I know and then the government that is somewhat subversive.
Wow. Again, if you're listening live right now, you can jump over to Podcast UFO and a 2-click sign in on our chat room. You can ask our guests this evening some questions. For the person, like, say, in listening right now, and say, like, Switzerland or the Ukraine, that may not have a whole sense of the Marcel family and Roswell, can you just kind of, in a nutshell, go over the story of your grandfather bringing the debris home and handling it and all that. Can you just kind of give the whole story?
Sure. In great brevity, a rancher named Brazel out in basically outside of Roswell, New Mexico, near Corona, had heard a large crash in the middle of the night. A large explosion rattled his little farmhouse or ranch house, and he investigated it, found some really strange debris, ended up talking to a local sheriff in Roswell, who in turn called the military base because it had some extraordinary, something he couldn't understand, didn't understand what the material was, had never seen it before. That phone call led to my grandfather's boss, Colonel Blanchard, and as my grandfather was the head intelligence officer for the 509th Bombing Group, and he was the perfect person at the right time to be sent initially over to the Wilcox's office to look at the debris and say, yes, this looks pretty strange to me, and that's where he was sent out, along with the disinformation officer, to look in a field full of this kind of debris. My grandfather, when he saw it, in his own words, he said that this was not made by human hands. Period. No question. Never weighed on it. Those were his exact words. He also knew how the military worked and knew that this was extraordinary, and it would be no time that this would be all swept up, and that probably out of any civilian view for a number of years, maybe indefinitely. And he broke records, or broke his basically his apologize for the word. Anyway, he went basically against regulation to go to his house that night with some of the debris, where he woke up my father and his wife Vio to show him the debris and to say, this is something extraordinary. I want you guys to see it. It's something probably nobody else has ever seen. And laid the debris out on the floor, and they tried to make some kind of sense for it. At the time, the technology was tubes and wires and that kind of thing, and none of that existed. And debris brought home with them just some interesting sheet metal, very lightweight sheet metal, little beams that turned out to have symbols on them if you look at them at the right angle, almost like a holographic image, and like a black plastic or a brown to black plastic material. With that, later that morning, he brought it out to the base, and that was really the beginning of it. He was really if I've always coined it, he was the lead investigator, and he ended up becoming a lot more involved later on. But that's kind of the story in a nutshell.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that just came to mind is, why didn't anyone that handled this stuff take pictures quietly? Actually, he had this in your house, right? In
his house in Roswell, yep. He had it
in his house, yeah. And he could have just snapped a picture. That would have been...
I think he was still mindful of his orders, and he was the head of intelligence for the most elite, really military group in the world, and I think he was still staying tight to that, and he wandered a little bit outside of that, but stayed close enough. Now there was a time later on that Blatchers were actually pretty good friends with my grandparents. And after it was all said and done, apparently he brought over a little piece, and they examined it at the house. And this was after, months after it was all long gone and brushed away.
You mean
and they had to talk about it.
They actually held on to a little piece of it for a while? Is that what you're saying?
This is the great mystery of the time, is that he brought it over to the house to show to basically sit in. They played bridge at night on the weekends, the Blanchards and the Marcels did, and he brought a piece over after everything was done so they could take a look at it. And that piece is somewhere. I don't know where it's at, but it ended up somewhere.
I'll give you $500 if you find that.
Yeah, but you got it. Okay.
And don't bring me tinfoil either. Hey, someone on the message board, Peggy's asking, what you meant by a disinformation officer?
Basically, a disinformation officer was sent out with my grandfather to look at the debris. They wanted somebody on the spot to be able to create a cover story. Now, the disinformation officer was not truly a military officer; they're a government official. So from the get-go, they wanted to create a cover story if it turned out to be what they thought it was. And he rode along with them, and my grandfather dispersed him back to town before my grandfather left the debris to go to his house. But it was I don't know if it was normal for the military to bring somebody like that along, but in this situation, yes, they did not go out without a cover story being written up to basically to cover it.
Yeah. Now, did your grandfather, or had you ever talked with your father or your grandfather? Did he interact with fellow officers about this? Did they? I mean, I can only imagine that if you saw something like this, you know, it would leave such an impression that you couldn't keep it to yourself. Like, for instance, you know, you hear of your grandfather, and then you hear of other people that were involved in it. But there had to be so many military people that were involved in cleaning this up. And the thing that always gets me is that you just don't hear a lot of people, like it wasn't, I know a lot of people took their oath very seriously, but there must have been a lot of talk between themselves. Have you ever heard anything about that?
He does, and his basically response to other officers who were involved were, because, you know, the typical military, they didn't want one person involved in the whole, like everything that Roswell meant, all the investigations, that kind of thing, was all separated. And some of his friends, which were fellow officers, he basically said, I wasn't privy to that information directly, but you can believe what they had to say, and they were talking about a second crash site, that sort of thing. So it was a hot topic. In fact, when the mortician, if you know along with the story, a mortician came over with, was asked to build some small caskets, and even in his remarks going over the thing, they said that Roswell was a flurry. There was, you know, the population on the air base was much greater than normal, and that there, like I said, there's a flurry of activity.
Right.
So it was quite a big deal. There is one really interesting facet to the whole situation, and that at the near the end of July, when things started, at least on the surface, appearing they're quieting down, my grandfather and Colonel Blanchard were both set on a 2-week leave of absence. And I know from my father or grandfather's side, anyway, that leave of absence wasn't to go home. It was basically to escape all, you know, eyes from both, you know, civilians, and also the relegation. That there wasn't a need for, you know, more paper could be drawn up. But he was
right.
He and Blanchard both got it at the exact same time.
I'm sorry, everyone. I'm in a hotel room. I'll repeat for the guests, for the people that are just starting to listen. I'm in a hotel room. My internet went down at my office. So I'm dedicated enough to rent a room to do the show. And my microphone I couldn't attach my microphone properly. And I thought I had it finally, and it just jumped right off of the table. So sorry for that noise. You know, that made me completely forget what I was going to ask you.
Well, like I said, well, you know, back to what you're talking about. I mean, there were a lot of officers involved, a lot of upper-level officers, and obviously, you know, you've heard the stories, read the stories about, you know, the other generals and commanders, that kind of thing, that were involved. As far as the people he worked with, you know, like I said, his friends that were officers, we know they communicated about it. I know that, you know, he and Colonel Blanchard communicated it quite often.
Really?
Yes.
Now, you know the famous photograph of the weather balloon debris, and did your father really get interested when they were able to decipher some of the text in that? My
father talked about that all the time. It was really fascinating that note, you know, looked like deciphered that there was something about bodies, and he talked about that quite often.
He did. Wow. Yeah.
Yes.
And you know, I thought about that just recently, and you know, I think as time goes along, we're going to get even more and more technical ways to discern letters like that. And I bet you, since that's an original photo that they're working with or negative, I bet you that thing gets cracked eventually. And, that still could be the smoking gun.
It definitely, it's out there. It can't be, it's available. You're right. As technology gets better and better, it's like I can't imagine more is going to come from that.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yep. And what other things did your father follow in regards to Roswell? Now, there's been a number of people that have written books about it. There's been there are a number of ongoing people still investigating it. Did he ever feel like jumping right in himself and doing some investigative work?
That's another good question. Not so much. I think he was happy with his part of the story, and he definitely had opinions about what some people were saying and some people were not saying, but honestly, not really. He just, I think his investigations went past Roswell, to astronomy, the cosmos, physics, the ability, we had more conversations about the structure of the universe than we did about Roswell in later years.
Wow. That's kind of a fascination of mine as well. Andy on the message board, who actually does the astronomy bits in the UK, just asked, wasn't Roswell near a nuclear base like Bentwaters? Now that's white, wasn't it? I'm getting my geography all mixed up. Was there any nukes anywhere near Roswell?
Well, all I know is there was, White. Let me see, what's the name of there's an air base real close there, White Sands.
White Sands, right?
There was a lot of activity in the area, and of course, I'm not quite sure exactly what happened on the air base directly, other than they were the nuclear bombing group for World War II. So I mean, as far as technology, it was all right there.
Yep. I forgot about that. You're right.
And it's obviously been questioned. Well, if there was a place that you wanted to take a look at, that they were the right place to be looking.
Yeah. Now, since the family was involved in this, another question on the board. I imagine, I had a sighting myself, and since I have, I'm constantly looking up in the skies. And did your family, anyone in your family, have any type of UFO sightings?
A big one. Me, my brother, and father were out in the country in Montana, and I noticed something strange up in the sky, and we pulled the car over and we sat and watched it for about 45 minutes, and it was actually, its behavior wasn't that of a regular aircraft. It was just moving erratically, then shot up out of sight. But we actually pulled over and sat and talked or watched for about probably 45 minutes, and that is as far as the family goes, that's what we saw.
Wow, that's pretty exciting for 45 minutes. And tell me, you took pictures?
No, we were just looking. I don't know if we even had a camera. We probably didn't have hand phone or cell phones back then and that kind of thing. It was well before that. But
I know. That's one thing you never think of is like back then. No, either you had your camera with you in the glove box or you didn't.
No, I mean we would spend. It was always interesting in the night sky in Montana. It was we lived out in the country. It was completely dark, no light,
wow.
No radiation or no pollution. Excuse me, and. It was fun to look at because you look up and see satellites all over the place, and then you might pick one out that maybe was going forward and made a 90-degree abrupt turn, that kind of thing. Where you think, well, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Because satellites don't behave like that, but that's obviously something floating around up there. So.
Yeah. Now I want to also ask you: did your father was in the medical field, and he had been for years now in the medical field? Or when he was serving the country, either way, did he ever get any ridicule about this? I mean, people probably recognized his name, that anyone that's looked into Roswell.
Not that I know of. I mean, there was his biggest thing that ever happened that I recall as far as ridicule, which might not be ridicule, is that at one point the government came forward and said that my grandfather was never in the military.
What?
And and my father, I've never seen him get so upset.
Oh, jeez.
And he, basically, he got it all straightened out, and they said, yes, it was an error. Okay, yes, you're right, he was in the military. But there was a period in the would have been the very early '80s where they actually said that my grandfather was never even in the military.
Oh my God, that sounds like an ongoing cover-up, doesn't it?
Yeah, and then imagine that all the records on Roswell burned up in a fire during the short period that Roswell had, the 1947 middle of July, that kind of thing, and it just a lot of amazing coincidences. But that, as far as standing out, now there were people that would and they don't really exist as much today as they did maybe 20 years ago. Some people that really went out on the edge speaking against anybody who saw anything. And I think there were some things written about my father which he more or less just laughed off. because if his saying if you can't attack the proof, then you're going to attack the person. But my dad was pretty impenetrable. I mean, he was a great American hero, really. And they tried, but it really he just slept it off. It wasn't very important to him. He knew the truth.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm sorry, I'm having trouble holding my mic. I have to move it again. Pardon me, everyone. If you could see the way if there was a camera in here, everyone would be laughing because I have this mic on a big arm that swings down, and the whole arm is what fell on top of me.
No.
So now I'm holding it. Now, didn't your father and your grandfather write a book, and didn't it get some heat? This is from the message board.
Now, my grandfather never wrote a book.
Okay.
My
father or grandfather. I'm sorry. So your father wrote a book.
Did.
Yeah.
And I don't know if any heat that so much came of it. There's it was. I think the only thing that people were upset about the book was that it didn't really have a lot of air, much outside of the what's already out there.
Uh-huh.
My father, he kept a little more of his personal life personal, and I'm not quite sure if that was mixing or whatever. But overall, not really. There was I know I was there when the whole book was when we were putting the book together. So not that I know of. I actually have a book out myself that it's kind of a tragic story. It put together was research for half a dozen years outside of what the family was involved with, and we were going to go on a book signing tour together. And when I was in Texas on a little vacation with the family, we got a phone call that my father had passed away. And literally, when I got home, a box of books from the publisher was sitting on the front desk, on the front step. So he never got to see the finished product. And that was kind of the next step in the whole journey, but it just didn't happen.
Yeah, that's really sad. I want to talk about the debunkers because there's been so many debunkers when it comes to Roswell because it's the case. It's the go-to case. I think when it comes to the whole UFO scenario. And how did your father deal with the debunkers? Before you answer that, there is the story about I think it's a toy company that somehow had hieroglyphic. I'm having a hard time saying that. The hieroglyphics on the beams, they thought that's where that came from, and they had answers for everything. And there are some adamant debunkers out there that just really attacked Roswell. And what did your father feel about that?
Well, if I could address each of those situations. One, there was the Dr. Moore who came up with the story that the Scotch tape that held the Rowan targets together was left over from the war, and it was actually Christmas tape, and the Christmas tape had symbols, Christmas trees, and I happen to have all the, we went back and I actually have all the tapes, which was released by Scotch and all those kind of things, those time period, and it's an interesting story. The biggest thing that I have is that's where we went through when we were doing this book is we have pictures of that tape, and then we have pictures of all the Rowan targets and highlighted where you can see all the edges on them, and the edges didn't have any of this kind of tape on them. Perfectly clear. It's nonsensical what they were saying. I mean, in their own photographs prove that what they're saying there's no truth to. As far as the debunkers go, there were a lot more of them in the 80s than the 90s and even now. And it's usually my father would always welcome a skeptic, always. Maybe it was this. Well, you're right. It was always very welcome. Where it wasn't welcome, it was because, well, you were, like I said, if you can't talk about the information, they try to attack the person. They just, relegated them to no. But honestly, there might have been some attacks going on, but it was small enough that, and at least within our family, we knew the truth that it really didn't phase anything. We always looked at a lot of people. It's one thing to be a skeptic and be reasonable and bring up evidence. There's all what it could have been, what made sense. Great. And when other people are doing it because they just have an axe to grind or whatever, then those kind of people are just kind of dismissed. But it seems like there's less and less of those people now. Definitely the younger generation. I have a couple of young kids, on the next couple of generations, and they more or less they like to see the proof, but they want to be proven that it's true, not proven that it's false.
Right. One of the debunkers, or a lot of them, I should say, are saying, well, the whole explanation behind this whole thing and why it was kept such the top secret is because of, it was the mogul spy balloon to hear if the Russians were, setting off nuclear weapons and all that. And so they'll go right into that, and they'll just stick with that. That's it, and that's the end of story. And I actually know a ufologist, basically, that thinks Roswell never happened. So there's a lot of people that, attack the story about the whole thing. But there's a lot of, there's still a lot of questions. I'm still baffled by the two different crashes. And, whether it was a collision, whether it was an escape pod, there's all kinds of theories behind that. And I think Stanton Friedman thought it was a collision, and another researcher, thought it absolutely was not. It was probably part of the ship, and that's where the crew was in, and, all that. Did I just ask you a question, or am I rambling? I can't.
Oh, no, you're talking. No, it is, Stanton Friedman, he definitely, when you talked to my grandfather, originally kind of brought the story public. I wasn't familiar with exactly what Stanton Friedman said, as he thought it was a crash. We've always had our own ideas, about what happened, what might not have happened as far as causing the crash, why it was where it was, those sort of things. Back to the Rowan target, it's that's a good argument. There's one thing that kind of pulls that one apart. If a debunker really wants to go back and investigate, then look at my grandfather, who just graduated from a radar intelligence school where they studied, amazingly enough, Rowan targets and the Mogul projects. And to think that he went out after getting a diploma in that exact area and not understanding what he was looking at is crazy. So you're caught in a position where you either believe that my grandfather was just part of a grand scheme to create a big story and there was a lot of collusion, or there's something to it. You really got to fall on one of those two sides of the line. Like I said, the Mogul balloon can be, there's so many holes that can be shot in that thing. Even, Dr. Moore, he met with my father one time, and they both agreed to disagree about some of the material. Like, for instance, like the foil on a Rowan target had a white paper backing, and everything that my grandfather and father talked about, it was the silver foil had no backing. It was very thin, that kind of thing. I mean, little things like that. Number two is Rowan targets were, they had basically a microphone and a recorder in them. None of that existed in any of the debris. They also had, a stream of balloons, 24, 30 balloons, lots of twine, that kind of thing. None of those was found at the crash site. Another point, I had to rattle stuff off. When was the last time you saw the military throw out a top secret project and make pictures of it and put it all over the newspapers, to keep people from, investigating Roswell further? It just, it doesn't make sense. The military wouldn't do that. And the Mogul Balloon Project was top secret. The materials in it weren't top secret. They could be found on a shelf at a store. But the actual purpose, I mean, they picked the better of two evils, in my opinion, that they threw out the Mogul Balloon and let the whole world know what we were doing with it, even though up to that point it was completely top secret. Versus anybody else talking about Roswell being a UFO, which, kind of doesn't make sense. Right.
Now, was there ever any doubt with your father or grandfather that this was an alien ship?
100% with my grandfather, absolutely, it was not from here. My father, what he said, basically it didn't make any sense. The only thing that made sense to him was it came from somewhere else. And like I said, he, in a way, devoted his life to it. His studies, his study of astronomy. So, and in his mind, yes. I mean, there was never a wavering. There was never, anything but this. And so you're talking about two people, first-hand witnesses that actually handled the debris, who believed completely it was from somewhere else. And like my dad kiddingly said, these Rowan targets, they're held together by balsa sticks. I had models hanging from my ceiling in my bedroom. They were made of the same stuff. Like I said, as a child, I would have figured that out.
Right. Right.
Not to batter that same old idea, but it's just like I said. They believe 100% it was from somewhere else, and then it just boils down to the integrity of the people involved, and was there collusion throughout the country and even some parts of the world that this was just some made-up story.
Right. Now, when your grandfather was out in the debris field. He was out in the main debris field. Is that correct?
Correct. The first debris field, the large one, yes.
And getting back, I know you mentioned something about the other site. Was that like a known fact through everyone that worked in the first debris field? Did everyone know that there was another crash site?
Not at the beginning.
It was kind of the need to know type of thing.
There were people. There were people on both sites, and they didn't interact. They weren't working together on it.
I see.
At that time.
Yeah.
Now the story, and my grandfather wasn't directly involved in this, so I can speculate or go by what the other people have researched as far as, the areas being cordoned off. There was, scraping up every little piece of metal they could find. In fact, I did research. I have one of my projects. We went through everything, and our argument is actually there's 3 crash sites, not just 2. Just
wow.
by patterns and the traffic and different sightings from different people and that kind of thing. But there was a lot going on.
Now, do you remember? Wasn't it like 40 miles apart, the 2 crash sites, or was it even further?
I should know that, but it was I think it was at least 40 miles.
Yeah. Now, who do you think the best researcher? I know you probably don't want to point the finger or point it away from someone, but who do you think is the best researcher right now when it comes to Roswell? Do you want to say that?
It's really hard to say. If you're talking about from the UFO side, Stanton Friedman was always a favorite, and then mine honestly is Donald Schmidt. Kevin Randall. They both seem to have their thumb on it. I like Kevin Randall. He's very methodical and not given to fancy and very precise about what he says. It kind of reminds me of my father a little bit, actually. And Donald Schmidt is an incredible historian.
Right.
And there isn't one topic about Roswell or people involved that he couldn't state chapter and verse of exactly what happened. So I would say those gentlemen.
Now, did you ever know of your father talking to other witnesses? I know after Stan Friedman, uncovered, I forget how many exactly, and that kept growing and growing. And I think there's something like 600 now in total. Yeah. But had your father ever spoke with any of the witnesses?
Yeah, some of the townspeople that were living back in that time had contacted my father in later years, and had talked about it. Some of the stories were dead on the way he remembered it. Some of them were kind of fanciful. So I couldn't give you a name of a specific person, but no, definitely some people. And it wasn't my father. Honestly, wasn't actually pursuing any of them, but some were actually pursuing him.
Right. Now I know the town of Roswell has kind of gone crazy. A lot of it. You drive through and there's. It's pretty. There's a lot of bizarre things going on there, and there's some there's some bizarre, fringy people there too, and that visit there, especially on the 4th of July. What did your father and what do you think about the fringe part of this and how it can muddy the water of what really happened?
It's all. Yeah, I mean, we've honestly tried to kind of stay away from the absolute fringe. Mm-hmm. But it's as far as them muddying the waters, some definitely they think, oh, it's just a bunch of kooks out there. But even in some of these people around the fringe, some of their stories are actually pretty amazing. And some are I honestly I give it that just rough 80-20. Yeah, 80% of what's out there is probably not a whole lot of truth to, but there's a little nugget of something some of these people are saying. Like I said, I try to. I was talking with a gentleman earlier this morning about this. Is that I kind of use my grandfather as the yardstick and my father. Mm-hmm. And if it gets too far away from what my grandfather, I was lucky enough to spend my summers with my grandfather fishing with him. So we talked about a lot of different things. And if it's too far from the way he talked about it, then I tend to think it's more fringy. I don't tell anybody you're just plain crazy. But I try to, like I say, use him for the yardstick, and depending on how far you get away from that yardstick's where I kind of lose.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, did your father know Dr. Edgar Mitchell?
Yes.
I bet they seem similar in a way, like similar type.
Definitely. I mean, we all. I and my sister Denise and my father were all at the Citizen hearing last year, and and he was part of that, and it was kind of an interesting event, and definitely they do see eye to eye, and actually my father was good friends with a number of astronauts. One of his favorite was actually a cosmonaut.
Really?
That he kept in pretty tight contact with. And it was just because some of the things that they had seen by when they're in space, they're just completely astounding. Very credible people saying, yeah, there's something watching us. No question about it. And they always like to anyway. So he really enjoyed the kinship he had with these people.
Right. Now, what do you think the future is going to be when it comes to the whole Roswell thing? I mean, you must contemplate what you think may come along as time passes.
What's interesting is Roswell's not losing any of its enthusiasm.
Right.
If anything, I just did I just came back from Brazil, and I did a little tour and had to give a bunch of lectures, and it was the book I have, they published in Portuguese down there.
Wow.
And when you talk to these people, it's very fascinating because they view Roswell as not only the truth, but the beginning of it all. Not that there was things there in the history, but that was what really made people's opinions start looking, that maybe there's something to all this. And like I said, if anything with them, it is very powerful. They not just Roswell, but they look at these experiences as being almost religious. Some countries will build monuments to sightings in Latin American countries. Completely different tact on it, but if anything, it's a very hot topic, and it's not losing any of its enthusiasm.
Wow. So let's talk about Brazil. That is one of the countries that does take it serious, along with Chile too.
Oh yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Chile, Uruguay, all the there was like one of the conferences I was down there was fun. It was. I was able to the lecture the person I was with was actually an astrophysicist, and he was part of the team that was there not as a debunker, but just kind of like, well, that's interesting, but we kind of see it this way in the science world. But it was a very nice crossing across of the different people involved, and we had talked about Roswell at length, and everybody, it was just complete fascination. Some people showed up just so they could talk about, just they wanted firsthand to talk with Marcel or whatever, however you want to put it, about Roswell. And so they really embrace it 100%.
Wow. That's really good to hear. And had your father ever toured in any country like that?
They had a world conference in, I think it was 97 in Rio, and he was part of that and really enjoyed it.
Right. Now,
and he was actually going to go there with me again. Of course, that didn't happen. But yeah. That was.
Now, when he had his practice, was he able to get away whenever he wanted to for these conferences?
Honestly, he didn't do that many. But yeah, he had a private practice. So he did have the luxury, as long as it was planned out far enough. He just planned his surgeries and office visits and that kind of thing away from it. And usually, a lot of times it happened over a weekend. Now Brazil was I think they do have conferences, medical conferences and that kind of thing. He managed in certain parts of the year to be able to leave. And there was another doctor in the small town of Helena at the time that could take over the caseload when he was gone. So he did manage to do it. It was really important to him. So
yeah. Well, we do want to talk about your book. And can you talk a little bit about that? What it encompasses and everything?
It's a fully illustrated, like a tabletop book of Roswell. It kind of goes from steps A through Z, and it also gives kind of a little personal insights and anecdotes from our family, some little fun things that happened and not so fun things, and just kind of an inside look at everything, but it doesn't read like a history book, or it doesn't read like some sort of a documentary. It's more of a novelistic approach. I
see. And how long did that take to put together?
About 3 years.
Oh.
By the time it was always done, and then it's I think it's in 5 languages right now.
Wow, that's great.
And it's actually doing fairly well. It's kind of it's not I hate to call it the baseline, but it's kind of like everybody's book on Roswell. If you're a believer, non-believer, I've heard of that. That sounds kind of interesting. The illustrations are amazing, and it's an incredibly good job. It's actually like you consider almost like a graphic novel. But everything's well supported, and the partner I had in researching it is she's a PhD out of England, and her PhD was in World War II aircraft technology. And it just fit like a dovetail into our research.
Right.
So
and
it was interesting. Okay.
What is the name, and where can someone find that?
Well, it's Alien Crash at Roswell. Not too imaginative, of course. And you
kind of cuts to the point.
The publisher did that. It was supposed to be called The Blue Room, but he changed it, or they changed it. And it's jessemarcel.com. You can go there.
Oh yeah.
And get it if you want a signed copy. It's bookstores and that kind of thing. When we did the book, it's kind of funny that at the same time we did the book, the publisher said, "Yeah, we'll do the book, but you have to do a documentary if you want to do this." And I said, "Sure." So I and Philip Coppens, I don't know if you're familiar with the name.
Oh yes.
He was one of the co-creators.
He passed away as early. I mean, young.
Yeah, it was awful. We did the documentary, and that and he called me and we were talking. I think it was in late October, early November, and he said he just wasn't feeling right and was going to go get some tests done, and literally within a week he was gone.
Wow.
He was such an incredible individual.
That was like on Facebook. He was in the hospital, and the next thing you know, yeah, you're right.
He was gone. He was taken in weeks. I mean, it was a very, very rare form of cancer. And we did a documentary. It's by the exact same name as a book. They're supposed to complement each other, but it was really sad. I mean, I didn't get to know him. But we're actually working on I'm working on a feeture film called Grail right now. And it actually it started with it when I was writing this book too, but it was really developed, and we had some really good conversations about it, and he actually helped me mold some of the ideas in it, and of course then he passed away. It was really tragic.
Right. Now I remember, this is kind of off the message board right here.
Sure.
There was a woman that wrote that she had solved the Roswell crash as being the Nazi craft filled with little people. Do you remember that? And people were buying into it. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Oh yeah, no, yeah. There's some validity, to what they're saying as far as because Hitler was involved with some kind of a technology. Nothing that would rise to the level of being able to get into our airspace, do these kind of things. But it's one of those things that, yeah, I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility. I don't think it is, but it's not out of the realm of possibility as far as there being little people in it. I've heard all these stories. We've never, as a family, as far as my father, grandfather, and us, the grandchildren, have never taken any credence in it. But as far as if you want a backup idea, I think it's just as credible as a Rowan target. Or a fire balloon, or any of those kind of things. Right.
Wow. Yeah, it's really something how, people want an explanation, and if they don't have one readily available, then they'll work on something until they get one.
Yeah.
And what are some other bizarre ones? Can you think of some other bizarre ones that you've heard about Roswell?
Marcy, there's some around the world. One of my favorites is when I was in D.C., I was with an Air Force pilot from Uruguay. And he had talked about they scrambled 2 jets because there was some kind of strange aircraft over their airfield. And they were told to shoot it down to get that it was and there was full radar contact. In fact, there were hundreds of people on the ground looking at this happen. And they went into they were trying to shoot this thing out of the air, and he was actually showing me with his hands, how it moved so much faster than they could possibly keep up with. And he thought, well, I took my airplane. I wish I could recall what the airplane was, but he said he ended up by going into a full outright climb thing. You go up a climb, and then flip over, and then come back down at it, and that way you could catch up enough speed. And he said, I'm going straight up, and I look at my window, and it's just floating right up along with me. And it's some of those firsthand. He had the documents with him. He was showing me the military reports. They weren't hidden. Just some of these amazing stories from these aircraft pilots that they're saying. And they said that, yeah, there was hundreds of people on the ground watching this crazy thing happen. And they said, and they tried to shoot. They said it was so much faster. They had absolutely nothing they could do. They said there was shoot down. They said it was a joke. They were so overmatched. It was just a joke.
Wow. Someone just wrote on the message board that they thought there was the CIA's explanation in the 1990s or 2000s. This story is what you're talking about?
The one I'm talking about right now?
Yes.
I'm not quite sure if the CIA had anything to do with it. Honestly, I didn't know anything about it until I met this pilot last year.
Oh, okay.
And so I just like I said, all these people, I've learned not to, and it's funny. I had a really good conversation with some of the congressmen in D.C. kind of, after hours we talked, and our conversation was simple, and that was everything we're talking about. This being seen, this testimony, that it's important. And my position was it's important, but it's inevitable that we will have something sitting across the table from us at some point now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, whatever it will be. But no matter what is going on now, it's inevitable that we will have, outright living contact with whatever these things are.
I believe so, too. Andy on the message board from the UK had heard that it was the Russians, little Russian people that were in some type of craft. So the story does get twisted all over,
That's interesting. I don't know. There's a lot of stories and a lot of hypotheses. I know the basics of it anyway. The really heart of the matter. And it's easy for me to say because I was right in the middle of it. If I was somebody on the outside, I don't know if I wouldn't be so invested in this story.
Right.
But yeah. I know just from having a front row seat to everything. That my goodness, whatever this thing was, it wasn't from here. My grandfather was not a fool. My dad, not a fool. And to think that they could not have figured out that this was something as simple as a Rowan target, or even if it was part of an aircraft, of Hitler. I mean, their technology wasn't that advanced that they still didn't have they still had sheet metal and rivets and those kind of things holding things together. It's not that that there's like I said. I think if you keep it simple, that there really isn't that the option is that it's something from somewhere else. Yeah.
Now, we probably have about a minute left here. So
okay.
Just want to know, what is your future in this whole thing? Are you going to stay connected to the Roswell story and do your part into getting it out there?
Yes. There's more and more people. And it's more than Latin American countries. I'm going to be doing more tours through Argentina and Uruguay and the rest of it, talking about Roswell, talking about the heart of the story. A little bit picking up where my dad left off, I could say.
Mm-hmm.
It might be a way to do it. So absolutely, it's there. I do have a love of and it probably grew out of Roswell, but a love of science fiction, that kind of thing. So I'm working on some projects. We're doing some movies and a feature film. It's going to be really Roswell's the heart of it, but kind of a different way of looking at the whole thing. It starts out with Catholicism a couple thousand years ago, and then works its way through today and then in the future. But so yeah, the Roswells is definitely a big part of my life and my family's life. The other grandchildren.
Well, Jesse, thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure.
All right, thank you.
Really enjoyed having you on. Well, that's it for our show today. If you missed any part of the show, you can catch it as a podcast and a whole bunch of other free podcasts on our website, which is podcastufo.com. Also, you can check out our links to stories in our show notes. We don't have any links or show notes this week because we didn't have any news, so I'm going to cancel that part. And I want to thank everyone for helping out with the show today. Our guest, of course, Jesse Marcel III. Keith Rowland for the producer of Dark Matter Radio Network. Andy Fleming for the Astronomy Look. Carrie Lloyd Whitehouse for the music. Peggy Shunning for managing our Facebook page. And remember to like us on Facebook for all the latest UFO and astronomy news. You can check us out live right here at the Dark Matter Radio Network every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And don't forget to jump in the chat room at podcastufo.com. This is Martin Willis saying keep your eyes to the sky and your curiosity high. See ya.